slice of the human being here, and the air goes this way and down into the lungs, and then into the alveoli, which are these little grape-like clusters here that have capillaries surrounding them. And so what we're going to do is focus on this section here where there's transport from the capillary across into the capillaries. Okay, so hopefully you remember how the heart and lungs and everything work from previous courses, but we'll take a look here. This tissue down here is going to be capillaries that supply the muscles and digestive system and all the other organs, and so oxygen's going to come in here. You're going to have cellular respiration in the cells that are fed by this, and they're going to dump carbon dioxide out into the bloodstream, and that's going to return to the heart via the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Actually, superior would be this one on the bottom, and they're going to dump into the right atrium. That's going to get pumped into the right ventricle, and that's going to get pumped out into this artery called the pulmonary artery. And this is a kind of cool artery because it's the only artery in the body really that carries deoxygenated blood. Arteries go away from the heart, and then veins return to the heart. And so this vein here, the pulmonary vein, likewise, is one of the only veins that carries oxygenated blood. So gas exchange happens in the lungs, dumps into the left atrium, left ventricle, and out the aorta. So this all works on partial pressure. Inhaled air is going to have a partial pressure of about 160 millimeters of mercury, and notice a lot less CO2. CO2 is actually pretty rare in the environment because of those polluting plants. Okay, and so what's going to happen is, because of the concentration gradients of carbon dioxide and oxygen, you're going to have exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen from the capillaries into the alveolar sacs. And that's going to exit the lungs, go in and find its way then to the body tissues, where you're going to have diffusion work, where the oxygen gets absorbed into the cell and carbon dioxide is dumped out of the cell. And then that's going to return, and then you're going to have low oxygen blood, high carbon dioxide blood going to the lungs. Now, one cool thing about carbon dioxide is when it dissolves in water, it forms bicarbonate or carbonic acid. And that makes this blood over here more acidic, makes oxygenated blood more basic. And we'll use that in just a second when we design our oxygen carrier. So I'd like you to use this as a thought experiment and figure out, if you were to design an oxygen carrier, where would you have your carrier have a high affinity for oxygen, and where should it have a low affinity? And then what are the local conditions like in those areas in terms of oxygen concentration, carbon dioxide concentration, and pH? So pause and think about it. Okay, so your oxygen carrier is hemoglobin. It's a protein, has 4 subunits, each of which has a heme, which is a prosthetic group that contains an iron, and the iron reversibly binds oxygen. And it's kind of cool because when one of those active sites is filled with an oxygen, it makes it more likely for subsequent ones to bind. And so when you have 3 oxygens bound, the 4th one really just kind of jumps on there. And the same is true in the reverse. Once one's removed, then it's more likely that the others will be removed. So you wind up with this cool curve here where you have, at low oxygen concentrations, there's a low affinity for oxygen, and at a high oxygen saturation, there's a high affinity for oxygen. And this is important because when you get to the body tissues, you have low oxygen concentration. The oxygen basically just jumps all at once off of the hemoglobin, And then when you get to the lungs, there's high oxygen concentration, and the oxygen really rapidly gets stuck to the hemoglobin. And that's exactly what you would want. Now, it turns out there's also a pH effect, and where carbon dioxide concentrations are high, pH is going to be lower. So the shift of this curve from the left to the right here corresponds to giving you a lower ability to bind oxygen when it's in a high pH environment, and an increased ability to bind oxygen when it's, I'm sorry, that's reversed. Increased ability to bind oxygen in a low pH or high acidity environment, and a decreased ability in a high pH, low acidity environment. So the lungs, where it's going to be higher pH, you more quickly dump off the oxygen, and in the body tissues where it's going to be relatively low pH, and we're only talking about 0.2 of a pH difference. So when we say low pH, just remember the body's pretty good at keeping the pH the same. But anyway, okay. So also has a couple other little adaptations here, and one of these is that in the red blood cell, this is a red blood cell here, and these are the body tissues, and so these guys would be respiring. And carbon dioxide is going to be transported into the capillary down its concentration gradient, of course. And it also then is going to transport across the membrane of the red blood cell. And when it does, there is a fast conversion of that carbon dioxide into carbonate, bicarbonate, and that happens fast. And you should be able to guess why that happens. So, hopefully you guessed that it was an enzyme. There's an enzyme here called carbonic anhydrase, which rapidly catalyzes this reaction and makes it go faster. And what that does is that decreases the concentration of carbon dioxide in the erythrocyte, which pulls carbon dioxide, makes it faster for carbon dioxide to come across the membrane here, which is great because what you want to do is soak up carbon dioxide as fast as you can and get it out of the environment there. Some carbon dioxide actually binds to hemoglobin along with a hydrogen from the bicarbonate, and part of this is exported. So this helps to maintain the pH a little bit. There is a slower reaction out here that acidifies the blood and accounts for the change in the blood pH. Okay, then once we get to the lungs, the reverse process is also true because we have carbonic anhydrase here in the erythrocyte. It rapidly dumps off this carbon dioxide into the environment of the capillary and then quickly dumps it into the alveoli. Okay, now how is this all controlled? Well, it turns out that there are receptors in the aorta and the vena cavas that can measure the amount of acidity and send signals to the respiratory control centers in the pons and in the medulla. And so these things regulate how shallowly and how frequently you breathe, and that regulates the amount of oxygen you get to your tissues. Okay, now probably you've all heard about high altitude training, and maybe you can guess why high altitude training would be good for you. It turns out that if you go to high altitudes, your body detects that you're not getting enough oxygen and secretes a hormone called erythropoietin, which increases the amount of red blood cells you use. So then you have lots of red blood cells, and when you go back down to a lower altitude, because the concentration of oxygen, there's a higher pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere down when you get lower, you have a greater capacity to move oxygen to your tissues. Now, some cheaters, like David Miller, who was a bicyclist who got a 2-year suspension for using synthetic erythropoietin. You can use this hormone to give yourself an edge in competition. So that's one of the things that David Miller and maybe some others, maybe even Lance Armstrong, who also is definitely a doper, might have used EPO. So, hope you enjoyed it. That's all I have to say about that.